So the next slide will show you the chronology of imperialism. What we have is a trickling out of the transatlantic slave trade. So we start to get different European powers making it illegal in the 1790s and the early 1800s. But what replaces that illegal, what'll become illegal trade in slaves across the Atlantic, is what I have to put in quotes as legitimate trades, because these so-called legitimate trades actually increase slavery on the African continent. A lot of them are based on the export of cash crops, and these cash crops, such as cocoa, are grown on plantation societies, some of which are owned by Africans and some of which are owned by Europeans, but they use slave labor. So our now legitimate trades are basically incorporating slaves who would have been traded across the Atlantic into plantation slave systems along the West African coast. So we have that transition from shipping slaves across the Atlantic Oceans to incorporating them into internal African systems of slavery. So we are going to have economic influence and economic changes on the West African coast, but until the 1870s, Africa was almost completely self-ruled. But that's going to start to change in the 1870s. What happens is that King Leopold II of Belgium starts sending out different explorers to make claims on African territory and force African chiefs to sign over large chunks of land and people. So we start having Belgium establishing rubber plantations and claiming territory officially for King Leopold II. And in 1884, 1885, this general trend, which has European explorers putting down flags and claiming territory in a rather haphazard way, is officially changed in a conference, the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. What the Berlin Conference does is it states that now European powers have to have effective occupation and produce economic development to be able to claim territory in Africa. So the effective occupation meant that they had to have some European officials on the ground. They had to have some kind of administration and bureaucracy so that they could show they had effectively occupied the area. Now, the occupying force might be a dozen people. There is no specification on how many people had to be involved in the effective occupation. And then as far as economic development, what this tended to do is mean that European powers would try to develop the infrastructure they needed to export the resources that they wanted from their African colony. But they had to make some kind of show of economic development, although it could be, and it generally was, for their own benefit and not some kind of economic development like hospitals or schools for the benefit of Africans. So there was ongoing resistance to colonization, and so much so that some historians actually have a whole separate period when they talk about colonization from 1870 to 1914 that they call pacification. So that would be 44 years of pacification where we had very big armed struggles against European conquest. Overall, the combat between Africans and Europeans was unequal when it came to the conventional warfare. While we did have, especially during the transatlantic slave trade, a trade in guns in mostly West Africa, but also South and East Africa, the technology that Africans had was on purpose less advanced than what Europeans were selling in Europe. There was also a conference that European powers held after the Berlin Conference where they said they wouldn't sell any more guns or ammunition to Africans, with the idea that they wanted to make sure that resistance fighters were unarmed or did not have access to European-style weaponry. So Europeans had mass-produced weapons. They tried to make sure that African resistance fighters didn't have access to weapons and ammunition. And another thing that came into play is that Africans were very vulnerable to scorched earth campaigns. The European occupiers, there are some very famous examples, would burn villages, farmland, so that resistant populations would starve to death and experience decades of famine. it ends up being that the Shaka example, that little picture on there is of Shaka Zulu, was not the most effective for most African states. Instead, it ends up being that most African resistance is more effective as guerrilla warfare. And one example of this is the Maji Maji. And this was a rebellion in Tanganyika, which was a German colony around the turn of the century. And so what had happened in this German colony is that the Germans had been collecting head taxes, which you had to pay per person in your family. And they had been requiring people to perform forced service for the state, so a certain number of days a week or a month. You would have to go and build roads or terrace. People hated terracing. That's very labor intensive. But you'd have to perform some kind of service to build the infrastructure of the state. And then what ends up leading directly to the rebellion is that Germans upped their quota for cotton production. And this upped quota for cotton production coincided with a period of drought, and people were forced to grow more and more cotton, so they didn't have enough land to grow their subsistence crops, so they were facing serious problems with malnutrition. And so with all these problems and drought and what were seen as very onerous German colonial obligations, there was a religious leader, or series of religious leaders, who promised rebels who would sign on to the task of trying to defeat the Germans that they had a special medicine that would make them safe from bullets. And this medicine was called Maji. It was actually a combination of millet and water, but it was supposed to turn the colonial army, the German colonial army's bullets into water. And this rebellion breaks out in the southern part of the state. I have that map on there which shows you the current day state of Tanzania. And the rebellion broke out in that region down south called Songea. But it spreads pretty far. And at first, the rebel fighters are fighting the German garrisons. So they're fighting armed soldiers. And this doesn't go very well because they don't have access to modern weaponry. So when they go head to head, they face very high casualties. Unfortunately, they find that the Maji does not protect them from bullets, or doesn't turn their bullets into water. But then they're able to much more effectively fight the German as guerrilla fighters. But what ends up turning this rebellion around and making it so that the Germans are victorious is that the Germans engage in scorched earth policies. They burn people's lands, they burn down their homes, and there's a period of famine, so that it's eventually the famine that forces people into submission to the German state. And we have a captain in the German army in 1905 who, this is a quote attributed to him, said, "Only hunger and want can bring about a final submission. Military actions alone will remain more or less a drop in the ocean." So in 1905, the Germans recognized that the guerrilla warfare could potentially be successful. So they planned this scorched earth campaign, which was, in their eyes, effective. It led to a famine that killed an estimated 100 to 300,000 people and effectively put down the rebellion. Although it's really important to note that later nationalists in Tanzania used this rebellion as an example to say, look, we unified against the Germans, when they are later trying to push out British colonial rule. And the rebellion was seen as a success because it lasted for 2 years. So even against German machine guns, our rebels who were not as modernly equipped fought on. And you can see that they faced reprisals. The Germans, they imprisoned people who they suspected of being involved in this Maji Maji rebellion. And even in the actual fighting, an estimated 75,000 people died. Leaders were executed. And then alleged Maji Maji fighters were hung or imprisoned.